Greetings, everyone, and welcome. My name is Fida Adeli, and I am the director of the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and the Clovis and Hala Salam Maksud Chair in Arab Studies. Before I introduce our event this evening and speakers, I want to read Georgetown University's speech and expression policy as a reminder to us all, and it will also be provided in the chat. Georgetown University is committed to standards promoting speech and expression that foster the exchange of ideas and opinions. While it is recognized that not everyone may share the same views as the speakers, it is expected that everyone in attendance at this event respects the right of the speakers and the organizing groups to share their perspectives and ideas by not causing a disruption. At the conclusion of the discussion, there will be a question and answer session during which you may ask questions and engage in dialogue. Because this is a webinar that will be via our question and answer window, please be sure to phrase your comments in the form of a question. And in the interest of time, we ask that each person be concise and ask only one question. Today's forum is sponsored by the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies in partnership with the Prince Alwaleed bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding and Georgetown University in Qatar and the MENA Forum, a student group here at Georgetown. We are hosting Omar, Shakir, Dana Kurd, Mouin Rabbani, and Khaled Elgindy for this event, Escalation of War in Israel and Palestine. I'm going to read just a brief bio for each of our speakers and then hand it over to them to begin our discussion today. Each of the speakers has prepared a presentation, and then our discussant will follow up with some questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So our first speaker is Omar Shakir, who serves as the Israel and Palestine Director at Human Rights Watch, where he investigates human rights abuses in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, and has authored several major reports, including a 2021 report comprehensively documenting how Israeli authorities are committing the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution against millions of Palestinians. Dana Kurd holds a PhD in government with concentrations in comparative politics and international relations, and has focused her work on authoritarian regimes in the Arab world, state-society relations in these countries, and the impact of international intervention. Her book, titled Polarized and Demobilized, Legacies of Authoritarianism in Palestine, was published in 2020 with Oxford University Press. Mouin Rabbani is a researcher, analyst, and commentator specializing in Palestinian affairs, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the contemporary Middle East. He has previously served as the principal political affairs officer with the Office of the UN Special Envoy for Syria, the head of Middle East with Crisis Management Initiative, the Marti Ahtisari Peace Foundation, and a senior Middle East and special advisor on Israel-Palestine with the International Crisis Group. Our moderator and discussant, Khaled Elgindy, is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, where he also directs the Middle East Institute's program on Palestine and Israeli-Palestinian affairs. He's the author of the newly released book, Blind Spot, America and the Palestinians from Balfour to Trump, published by the Brookings Institution Press in 2019. Khaled is also an adjunct professor at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown. So again, each speaker will start with a 5 to 7 minute presentation, and then our moderator, Khaled Elgindy, will follow up with questions to the speakers. And so I'd like to invite Omar Shakir to start us off.
Thank you, and thank you to the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies for hosting. It's always special, even in these tough times, to be back at CCAS, where I did my master's a long time ago. Where to start? Let me just start by saying it's great we also have a forum to have this conversation. I know that many places around the world, not just in the US, space to have these kinds of conversations is shrinking. Let me start by noting that we're precisely here in a moment of really unprecedented violence and repression, abuses at a scale that are just unfathomable just a week or two ago, precisely because of the flagrant disregard for international law that has taken place for far too long, impunity for state-sanctioned repression, for unlawful attacks that have been committed for years and for decades. Of course, the bloodshed did not begin on October 7th. But for the purpose of my brief introductory remarks, let me sort of give a quick sweep of some of the human rights and legal issues that we're currently seeing and place them in their context. Let me start by saying that the October 7th assault attack by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups on Israel involved clear war crimes, deliberately targeting civilians, spraying gunfire on partygoers, infiltrating homes, shooting at people in their homes, taking hostages, civilians, including women, including children, parading them in the streets of Gaza. These are all acts that are unlawful under international law. There is no justification for them. International humanitarian law holds all parties on the same scale, regardless of imbalances of power or context, and they have no justification. Israel's cutting of humanitarian, let's start by saying Israel's cutting of electricity, fuel, water, and sort of these internet in many places, the blocking of humanitarian aid, that is textbook collective punishment, which is a war crime. It's also starvation as a tool of war is also a war crime. The Israeli government has been crystal clear about the intent for these policies, and that is a criminal intent. The Israeli government has dropped hundreds, thousands of bombs on Gaza using explosive weapons in a densely populated area. We're still investigating the airstrikes, but what's clear is that hundreds of children, of civilians have been killed, entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. As we speak today, people in Gaza are asleep, not knowing if they'll make it to the morning. Human Rights Watch has over years, over decades, documented Israeli strikes that wipe out entire families. In one fell swoop, that knock down high-rise buildings that have home to hundreds and to businesses. We're seeing apparently many of these same tactics. We've seen high-rise buildings knocked down. Human Rights Watch just in the last hour has released a report documenting Israel's use of white phosphorus, both in Lebanon and in Gaza. The use of white phosphorus in densely populated civilian areas is unlawful. We've also, of course, seen Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups launch thousands of rockets indiscriminately at Israeli population centers. Indiscriminate attacks, whether they be in Gaza or in Israel, are war crimes. I should note that Human Rights Watch has also documented Israel deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure, over the years, disproportionate and indiscriminate attacks. So it's important, though, to remember when listing all of these different abuses that the bloodshed did not start on October 7th. They come in the context of Israel's sweeping, unlawful 16-year closure of Gaza. That closure policy has been a part of a more than half-century-long occupation characterized by systematic human rights abuse. I should note that the closure itself involves a generalized ban on the travel of people, sweeping restrictions on entry and exit of goods. Even before these events in the humanitarian crisis, 80% of the population of Gaza relied on humanitarian aid. The people of Gaza have, as I noted, half-century occupation. The majority of Gaza's population are refugees who are denied their right under international law to return to the homes that they were expelled from or forced to flee from in 1948 during the Nakba. In addition, of course, this is not the first round of hostilities. We've seen rounds of them take place over time and time again. In addition, I should note that Human Rights Watch, of course, has found, as noted, that Israeli authorities are committing the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution against Palestinians. So Palestinians live a daily reality of structural repression, of structural violence. All of this is to note, again, the situation that we're dealing with today is in some ways unprecedented, but of course, the roots of it are in these long-term situations. So before I sort of end, let me just sort of say what are some of the key things that we're calling for now in a situation where many in Gaza do not have electricity, water, internet, fuel. The situation will only deteriorate. Some of the key asks must be, one, to push for allowing vital humanitarian aid in now, as well as obviously food, water, electricity, fuel. It's important that European states do not cut vital aid for Palestinians. It's critical that All states call on parties to adhere to international humanitarian law, including not targeting civilian infrastructure, civilians, no indiscriminate, disproportionate attacks. There needs to be a call to lift the closure of Gaza. There needs to be a call for accountability. There needs to be a recognition of the reality of structural oppression against Palestinians. This is not a conflict between equal parties, even if multiple parties did commit serious abuse of international law. And there must be an end to all forms of complicity by governments and businesses in serious abuses. I want to reiterate casualty numbers, for those who haven't checked, were over 1,500 Palestinians killed in Gaza, again, including more than 500 children, according to reports by Gaza's health ministry. We have over 1,300 Israelis. That's not including the more than 1,500 largely Palestinian militants that were killed inside of Israel. There are more than 300,000 internally displaced in Gaza. It is numbers of a scale that simply weren't fathomable but a few days ago. Again, we need to understand this in the context. We're precisely here because for too long, there's been impunity. Apartheid has been allowed to stay in place. Structural oppression, structural violence, movement restrictions, those do not justify the heinous attacks by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups. But it's critical to understand that we'll continue to see this situation deteriorate. I think things that were previously unimaginable are very much possible in the current moment, not just in Gaza. We can't forget the West Bank, where we're seeing settler violence, which already, again, 2023 saw record levels of repression and violence against Palestinians. More Palestinians killed in the West Bank in 2023 than in any other year since the UN began recording fatalities. More Palestinians in administrative detention without trial or charge than any other year in 30 years, I should say. Settler violence on the rampage. This current situation, the fog of conflict, the seeming, the legitimacy that the Israeli government feels that they have could create unspeakable atrocities. There is talk of revenge. There is talk of a ground invasion. What I just laid out could well be the tip of the iceberg. I'm afraid we're heading and descending to a depth of darkness and hell that I simply couldn't have imagined happening.
Thank you, Omar. That was very sobering. Dana, we're going to hand it over to you.
Yes, thank you for having me. Today I'm going to speak about the regional dynamics. Omar alluded to some of this related to kind of widespread impunity, but yeah, so let me begin with where we stood before the attacks on Saturday and explaining some of that context. So in the last couple of years, especially, I think we have seen a hastening of policies that sideline Palestinians and that attempt to conflict manage in a way that don't address any of the underlying causes of the conflict. This is clearest in American foreign policy in its pursuit of normalization deals, whether it was under the Trump administration or the Biden administration. Essentially, they have bought into the idea that they can secure the Israeli side through sheer force. And all of the normalization deals that have taken place or discussed to be pursued in the future don't take into account actual meaningful change in the status quo between the Israelis and Palestinians. On the Arab side, in terms of Arab governments, some have normalized, but some have not just normalized. They've also actively taken positions against the Palestinians. They've actively vilified Palestinians, actively disempowered them. They've targeted pro-Palestine activism in their own countries, as my research has shown, and limited the space for regional solidarity. So Palestinians are finding themselves not only cut off from even, rhetorically actors that used to claim to be in solidarity with Palestinians, but also actual activists and organizations and actors that were in solidarity with Palestinians now have limited or no space to engage. All of this as well goes in hand with an international community that shows a complete disregard for holding Israel accountable, as Omar mentioned. So this is the context that we've been dealing with, and it's empowered, I think, the worst actors to not only get involved, but to also weaponize what has happened and to give the impression to the Palestinian public and to the Arab publics that still are very much pro-Palestinian, and then to give them the impression and lend credence to the idea that this conflict is zero-sum and that any kind of liberatory or progressive future is not possible. Now, to be clear, I don't think that we have no reason to suggest that this was ordered by any regional actor like Iran or anything like this. And I also don't think that the timing or the scope of these attacks had to do with thwarting normalization. I've seen some reporting on this. This is beyond that. But what I am saying is that this regional dynamic has added fuel to the fire, and precipitated this kind of mass violence. I would also say that we know that given trends in recent years and given trends in Palestinian politics in recent years, if this hadn't happened, something else would have happened. Given the fact that for Palestinians themselves in the occupied territories or in Palestine, wherever Palestinians may be, they've seen closed off political spaces. They've been criminalized in the global north as well as in the Arab world. In the occupied territories, these are basically captive populations, not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, where the only organizations or actors that are allowed to represent Palestinians have been hollowed out, completely powerless in the face of continued Israeli aggression. And that has led to a situation where in the latest polling by the Palestinian Center for Survey and Policy Research, 58% of Palestinians support armed resistance. Give it not because they're bloodthirsty, not because it's desperation. I mean, if you think about all of the strategies you could pursue, and all of them have been closed off, then this becomes the alternative. And so that has also created a space for actors like Hamas to claim to be the bulwark of resistance and act in that way, because they also have a Palestinian public to think about and answer to. So that, I think, is the situation. I will just say one last thing about societal responses around the region. So I've been discussing kind of at the government level policies and their impacts, but I will also like to highlight the fact that Arab publics in repeated polling have been against normalization, and they don't support this as a policy. And especially in the aftermath of something like this, or in the ongoing attack on Gaza, we've seen protests even in places where that space has been closed off. So places like Qatar, places like Bahrain, even the UAE. I was surprised to see a local writer for a local newspaper wrote some very strong things about the Palestinian cause. I mean, I don't know how long it'll stay up, but this is something that has taken place. So in Kuwait and Morocco, Jordan, Egypt, Oman, even in those places where the Gulf states that have normalized or are thinking about normalization, there is an outpouring of support and attempt at activism. So I just wanted to also mention that aspect of the regional response. And yeah, I'll be happy to answer more specific questions in the Q&A.
Thank you, Dana, for giving us that broader context for which to think about these current events. Mouin?
Thank you, Fida, and thank you very much to the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies for organizing this webinar and inviting me to participate. Like Omar, I'm also a graduate of CCAS, though I suspect at least several decades before him. So I've been asked to explain briefly the motivations and objectives of Hamas in launching its offensive of the 7th of October. And I think the first thing that needs to be recognized is that this was an offensive that was many months in the making. This could not possibly have been a response to something that happened last week or last month. And probably the planning and preparations for this began around the time the current Israeli government took office, or even before then. So what were the main motivations? And why did this result in what we've seen during the last week? Hamas, as you may know, seized power in the Gaza Strip in 2007 and has been ruling the Gaza Strip since that time. And since before it seized power, the Gaza Strip has been under a highly effective Israeli-Egyptian blockade, which over the years has become both progressively more inhumane and dehumanizing. There have been several rounds of confrontation previously between Hamas and the Israeli military, between Israel and the Gaza Strip, however you want to term it. And each time these have resulted in a ceasefire in which various arrangements are made to either relieve the siege or address it in other ways. And those generally have only been partially implemented. Now, I would like to go back to 2021 and what Palestinians refer to the Unity Intifada. I think this was a key event because there, for the first time in all these confrontations between Hamas and the military, for the first time it was Hamas rather than Israel which took the initiative to launch the confrontation. And no less importantly, Hamas launched the confrontation for reasons that had nothing to do with the Gaza Strip. It was about East Jerusalem. It was about the growing Israeli intrusions into the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Haram al-Sharif compound. And at the end of the day, another ceasefire was reached, and things went back to normal. But ultimately, nothing changed. Nothing changed in terms of the blockade of the Gaza Strip. Nothing changed in terms of the growing Israeli encroachment upon the Al-Aqsa Mosque, a key issue, I would argue, because we need to remember that Hamas and Islamic Jihad are, after all, Islamist movements for whom these are very important issues. And nothing changed in the West Bank, where settlement activity has been expanding at an accelerating pace, and since the Trump years is basically being prepared for formal annexation. And I think Hamas took the view that it needed to do something spectacular to shatter the status quo. It saw that what it did in 2021 essentially didn't change anything, and it would need to do something on a size and scale and scope that would definitively shatter the status quo. Now, I fully agree with everything that Omar said about attacks on civilian non-combatants. That notwithstanding, I would like to emphasize that Hamas understands very well that if it wanted to sear anything into the conscience of the Israeli leadership, it would have to hit the Israeli military hard and decisively. And I believe that that was a key objective of what we saw on October 7th. And what we saw was within several hours, Hamas and Islamic Jihad fighters and militants taking control of all the bases of the Gaza division, which is responsible for conditions in the Gaza Strip, to put it simply, managed to eliminate many of its soldiers and leaders and cart off all kinds of equipment and files and so on, and really shatter this entire myth of the invincible Israeli army for whom no Arab adversary is a match. And so to that extent, I think a key objective of what Hamas sought to achieve was achieved. And I think Hamas was also responding to this Israeli attitude towards it, which is that, you know, as long as we allow them to continue governing the Gaza Strip, we can continue to go our merry way in Jerusalem, in the West Bank, with respect to the Gaza Strip, with regional issues, as Dana has just mentioned. And Hamas, I think, was also seeking to demonstrate that, yes, we're the government of the Gaza Strip, but we have now reached the point where we are no longer content simply to govern at the expense of what remain fundamentally national Palestinian issues, and that we are in fact prepared to risk our continued governance of the Gaza Strip in pursuit of those national objectives. Now, this has often been compared to the 1973 October War and the shock that resulted from the initial joint Egyptian-Syrian offensive against the Israeli army. In part, I think that's accurate in terms of the shock waves it generated within Israel. But I think it's inaccurate in that if you have looked at Hamas's statements, it's really lacking a strategic objective. You can identify what they're hoping to do. I find it much more difficult to divine what they are actually hoping to achieve once they have shattered the status quo. And so Hamas leaders who have been giving media interviews have said, we will begin to identify these issues in good time. My suspicion is that they haven't really clearly thought through what their objectives are. Of course, they've spoken about a prisoner exchange, and I think the prisons were another key issue, of course, for Hamas. And they've spoken about other individual issues, but they have not laid out a clear strategic objective. Is it to end the siege? Is it to end the occupation? Is it to end the state of Israel? Is it to draw the region into a confrontation with Israel, particularly on the Lebanese front? Those, I think, remain unanswered questions. One final point I'll make is that on the one hand, what happened on October 7th, I believe the results went beyond the wildest expectations of Hamas and Islamic Jihad. I would argue almost that one needs to ask if they were sufficiently prepared for what they did on that day. At the same time, I also find it inconceivable that they did not devote at least as much preparation to dealing with the Israeli response as to dealing with their own actions. And those are, of course, issues that will become increasingly clear in the days and weeks ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mouin and Dana and Omar. I have a whole list of questions in addition to questions that are coming in from our audience. I think the biggest thing, I think we're all struck by the scale and the scope of what happened on October 7th, and therefore also expected that the scale and scope of Israel's response would be greater than anything we've seen. Let me come to you, Mouin, on your point about the lack of strategy. I mean, I think this is something that everyone is struggling with. I get asked this all the time by reporters and others. What is Hamas's endgame? And I actually have no answer, because I cannot tell what their endgame is, especially if, as you said, they didn't put as much time into thinking about what Israel's response would be. I'm sure they imagined some very large military response, but at the same time, it's also not clear to me what Israel's endgame is. We've been down this road many, many times before, maybe not at this level, again, I mean, it's sort of more of the same, but just bigger in terms of what Hamas has inflicted and Israel's response. And in the meantime, there's really no third party. I mean, I think the other thing that's different here is that we don't have responsible international third parties playing, a responsible role here of trying to intervene. That obviously has a lot to do with the, kind of shock and horror of it all. But where does that leave us? I mean, if no one can intervene, and no one, well, not that they couldn't, but that no one is, where does that leave us? Sort of broadly to all of you, but specifically I want to come to Dana and ask about the regional response in terms of what is Egypt doing? What is, we hear about this international corridor that the US is trying to open up with Egypt. What does that mean for Egypt? What does it mean for the Palestinians? What does that mean for the, elongation of this conflict? And then I'd like to put the same question with a slightly different spin to each of you. So what is the region doing, Dana, to bring this to an end, if anything?
I mean, the Egyptians have expressed that they will not allow for Palestinians to flee, but there is a discussion about the humanitarian corridor. Hard to say how quickly that can happen, or what its overall impact on the conflict will be, given that Israel has bombed the Rafah border crossing twice. So it's difficult to see how quickly Egypt can, or any of the parties involved can facilitate this. I think Egypt is a very reluctant actor. I mean, they have the love or sympathy for the Hamas government or the Palestinians, and they happen to be in this semi-mediator role just because they are, they do share a border. In terms of other actors around the region, that's what, when I said that this is going to be weaponized by certain actors, the worst actors around the region. So we have, Iran claiming victory and Iran claiming support, further kind of polarizing the Arab and Palestinian public. And then we have Arab governments who, have varied in the degree of their response. It seems at this point, at the level of statements and rhetoric, I haven't seen anything substantive. I don't know if others disagree, but I haven't seen anything substantive to try to end this. And I mean, to your question, Khaled, like to the beginning of your question about, what's the end game and like what's going to happen next, I think you and I are in the same boat, that we keep saying it's going to be worse violence. This is going to get worse. The West Bank will also, not stay dormant. This is going to be kind of a spillover effect in many fields of activity.
Great, thank you. You feel free to respond to another. Mouin, did you want to weigh in?
Well, I wanted to respond to the first part of your question about, where's the end game? I mean, if we were to take the analogy with the 1973 war a step further, and again, I want to emphasize that for a variety of reasons, it's a very imperfect analogy. But, in 1971, Israel's defense minister, Moshe Dayan, made a infamous statement that if I have to choose between peace without Sharm el-Sheikh, a key town in the occupied at the time Sinai Peninsula, if I have to choose between peace without Sharm el-Sheikh or Sharm el-Sheikh without peace, I choose Sharm el-Sheikh without peace. 2 years later, you had the 1973 war. Israel's military doctrine was shattered. Its sense of security was shattered. And by the end of the decade, Moshe Dayan was a lead negotiator with Egypt to relinquish the Israeli occupation over the Sinai Peninsula and return it to Israeli sovereignty. And I don't think that Hamas has thought things through to the extent that by, for the first time in 1948, an Arab military force operating on Israeli territory and completely demolishing Israel's military doctrine that wars have to be quick, decisive, and fought on enemy territory, and so on. I don't think they've thought through that when this confrontation is over, this is where we want to be in order to achieve that. But I think this general sense that in doing so, in doing what they have done, they will shatter the status quo and open up new possibilities. I think that's as accurate a description of their strategic thinking as I can give. They would argue we were dying a slow death. We decided instead to make a last stand to see if that last stand would end our slow death and give us a new lease on life. But having said that, another consequence of the 1973 war was, of course, the growing, accelerating rise of the Israeli right in the form of the Gush Emunim settler movement, and so on. And I think it's also important, I think, Khaled, as you mentioned, that what we're seeing now is not just more of the same or even much more of the same. We're seeing something fundamentally different, where Israel is razing entire neighborhoods of the Gaza Strip to the ground, where Israeli leaders are openly speaking of ethnically cleansing the Gaza Strip, and if not, physically deporting them, making conditions of life impossible within the Gaza Strip. So there are all kinds of transformative changes that are going on. And I would agree that I think, neither Hamas nor Israel have clear strategic objectives at this point about, where would they like to be 2 or 5 or 10 years from now.
Thanks, Mouin. Omar, I want to come to you and pick up on this point that Mouin mentioned about the scale of the destruction. This is something that we haven't seen. It's similar tactics, but on a scale that we haven't seen before. And you mentioned, or you alluded to, the possibility of even greater atrocities. Are you seeing? I mean, based on your work in other conflict contexts, what are the conditions that you see that are most alarming in terms of any type of future mass atrocities, like a mass expulsion of Palestinians or simply large-scale killing? I don't know at what point. I don't know the technical legal criteria for what would constitute genocide. But how close are we? I mean, how many of the red flags are you seeing? In other words, what are those red flags? And how do you explain the international community's lack of response? And at what point, how long can they continue to sort of give Israel a free hand?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of warning signs, right? I think if you read some of the reporting, I think there was a piece in the Wall Street Journal today that was just quoting some of the Israeli soldiers who were getting ready to do the ground invasion, and the rhetoric they use around revenge and retaliation, the kind of brazenness with Israeli officials talk about what they're doing. There's not even an effort to play with international law. It's just outright, we're cutting electricity, water. We're talking about quotes describing the 2 million people of Gaza as human animals. You're seeing, just even in the public rhetoric, a willingness to basically treat all of Gaza as a legitimate target. So when you combine that, so on one hand, you see the rhetoric where it is. Secondly, I think the Israeli government sees how the international community has reacted. And even the sort of empty platitudes that you often see about restraint, about complying with international humanitarian law. You're just not even seeing that enough, right? I mean, these are the most basic things that normally we say don't go nearly far enough, and you're not even seeing that notification. I mean, you might have seen that even in the UK, you have some of the most progressive political figures, even from the progressive parts of the Labour Party, that refuse to say on TV that cutting, electricity and water to the entire civilian population is a war crime, which is sort of, I mean, you don't need to be a lawyer to answer that question. So, okay, so you combine the rhetoric, with the not having a significant pushback. Combined as part of that, I want to make that a second point, which is that Israel feels like it now has the legitimacy of having been wronged, right? I mean, of having atrocities at a scale committed against its own people, right? And one that's penetrating in many different ways. And I think it's again worth noting the difference between, for example, 2021, where the outbreak of the conflict, the outbreak of hostilities was against the backdrop of Sheikh Jarrah and forcible transfer. So much of the rhetoric shifted to root causes and the underlying context. Here, you're seeing a reversal where people in their brain, again, we've talked about the nuanced reality, but people don't start looking 75, 56, 16, no matter number of years. For most people, October 7th is the starting point. So then when there's a sense that we have now sort of an authorization because of this thing that we experienced, they feel like they have something there. Then you add to it the composition of the current Israeli government. Who's there, what things they said before October 7th, right? Wiping out Hawara, committing population transfer. I mean, they were saying these things before October 7th, right? So you look at, again, it's linked to the rhetoric, but it's also about sort of what the government plans are. You look at the political dynamics, you have now a unity sort of government there, so there isn't even the element of a political opposition front. And that the Israeli government has popular support. If you look at what people want, there seems to be a real sense of wanting something to change the equation. Put all those things together, and again, all bets are. And I'm generally somebody who, when it comes to looking forward, tend to be more careful in saying that we're, what could come, might reach unprecedented levels, but it's difficult to see how this ends in a way that doesn't involve something that's orders of magnitude even more dark and terrible than even what we've experienced in the last week, which has already been an order of magnitude in many ways more significant than we've seen before.
Thanks, Omar. Mouin, you're muted, but I was about to come to you also.
Okay, but if I could just add very briefly to what to Omar's one of Omar's points, which is that I think we have to recognize the mutually reinforcing dynamic between Israeli action on the one hand and the position of Western governments on the other. I mean, when you have Israeli leaders making these increasingly extremist statements, and then you have someone like the British opposition leader, Keir Starmer, saying, yes, Israel has the right to cut off water and electricity and so on. It emboldens Israel. And if you look, for example, at Biden's speech the other night at the White House, where he basically said, I'm not attaching, Israel has a blank check. It will choose how to defend itself. And I have full confidence in it because, like the United States, it observes the rule of law and warfare. That's a license to kill. It's a license for mass slaughter. So there's a mutually reinforcing dynamic between the two.
Yeah, and that's the big question: is how long can that be sustained? I mean, eventually there will be a lot of pressure, at least coming from the region, as Arab publics become more and more outraged at the casualties. But Omar, if I could stay with you, Mouin, I want to stay with you and ask you about the situation inside Israel. We heard about this unity government, but how much of that is actually top versus down, right? I mean, at the grassroots level, there's tremendous amount of anger at the government. I think everybody agrees that this was a colossal, I think maybe of epic proportions in terms of intelligence and security failure. In my view, far greater than 9/11 or anything along those lines, because this was right under Israel's nose in one of the most heavily surveilled areas on earth. And so there's an element of humiliation. The public is angry. How did they let this happen? In addition to, there's also quite a lot of anger at how the hostage situation is being handled. The families of the hostages don't have access to information. And we're even seeing, ministers being chased out of hospitals, by angry citizens. What does this mean, do you think, for Israeli politics going forward? How stable is this government?
Well, I'd like to refer to a piece that was recently written by Jeffrey Aronson, and it actually appeared a few days before October 7th, where he referred to the current Israeli government as kind of a revolt, its composition as kind of a rebellion, if you will, against the establishment that has ruled Israel since 1948, whether Labour or Likud, that it has come out of the Israeli security establishment, and now you have a government, or two of whose key members, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, have built their political careers in opposition to this security establishment, and that it kind of signals a potential changing of the guard. And what I found so interesting about Netanyahu's formation of this emergency cabinet is that he has brought in Benny Gantz, who's not only an opposition leader, but also a very prominent representative of, let's say, the traditional security establishment, along with another general from the opposition. And today I saw an interesting interview with a Likud politician who I think is a former chief of staff or minister of defense, Moshe Ya'alon, where he was criticizing these people for entering this cabinet, because he was saying, anything goes wrong and Ben-Gvir and Smotrich will blame them, and in effect thereby increase the power of these new neo-fascist forces at the expense of those who have been ruling the roost in Israel since 1948. So, we had this growing polarization within Israeli institutions and Israeli society during the past year. What happened on October 7th, regardless of what we're seeing now in terms of a new cabinet and so on, I think ultimately will serve to deepen it.
Thanks, Mouin. Before I come to you, Dana, I just want to ask all of our panelists, have a look at the Q&A box if you haven't already, and see if there are particular questions that are directed to you or that you would like to cover, and that will just make my job easier. Dana, I want to ask you about the impact on Palestinian politics. A lot of people might look at this and say, well, this was kind of a suicide mission for Hamas. As Mouin said, it's like their last stand, because certainly the Israelis are speaking in sort of annihilationist terms. The Hamas will not be allowed to remain as a military or governing force in Gaza. What does that mean? But also, what does that mean for the other guys that we never hear about over in the West Bank, Mahmoud Abbas and his crew? How relevant are they? I mean, I know Abbas today met with King Hussein, and he met with Tony Blinken, I think, or is scheduled to. How relevant is he? And how does Palestinian politics come out of this? How do they cope with the potential vacuum that would be left either by Hamas's departure or the PA's departure or both?
So I want to refer people to Tariq Baqoni's interview in the New Yorker. He's written a book called Hamas Contained, and I would tend to agree with him that even if Israel was to inflict a huge amount of cost on like the governance structure or the militant faction of Hamas, I don't think that means ending Hamas, because Hamas also has an ideological component that seems quite attractive to especially a young Palestinian public that hasn't had any other political alternatives. So I think I will say that. I think Hamas also is not only in the Gaza Strip. They are, some of their actors are around the region as well. So I'm not sure that it's possible for them to completely obliterate Hamas. That being said, what all of this shows, I think, has been repeated a number of times, that the Palestinian Authority is completely irrelevant. And other political factions are completely irrelevant, Fatah included. They haven't been able to impose any kind of influence on this dynamic. In fact, I remember when this first started, I think Abbas called for a meeting of the Arab League or something like that. I mean, it was just a joke amongst Palestinians on social media. So what this means in the kind of medium to long term, I don't know, again, that the PA is like going to collapse overnight, but it's increasing irrelevance, and then maybe a huge cost to Hamas. What we're going to see is greater and greater devolvement and fragmentation of Palestinian politics. And we already kind of saw that in the last couple of years, especially in the aftermath of the Unity Intifada, where you see those armed factions that are emerging in particular locales around the West Bank. And I think that Palestinians are aware that this is a possibility. Polling about internal fighting shows that Palestinians are concerned about this. So yeah, it's not the greatest answer, but I think things are going to devolve quite quickly. And the problem is that wherever the organic kind of leadership has emerged, young Palestinian voices who have a different vision or have organizing capacity. I mean, they've either been imprisoned or exiled or repressed in some way, or have reached a point of burnout so that that they exit. And so, yeah, I think that, I mean, sorry to speak like not academically, but I'm just so angry that the international community has led us to this point. We're going to see really untold horrors in the next coming months.
Yeah, and the most difficult thing about that, I mean, apart from the actual horrors on the ground, is that everybody predicted this. Everybody who's ever talked to anyone or who in Palestine or had been traveling there would come back and say, there's so much despair, there's so much anger, there's so much frustration, there's no horizon, and something's going to explode. And here it is. I think the scale of the explosion is much bigger than certainly I anticipated, but not surprised that it did happen.
Everyone except Jake Sullivan.
Yes, of course. But Biden's whole approach is sort of untethered from reality on so many levels. Omar, I want to come back to you and ask about Gaza. Before I ask you a specific question, just to make things a little bit easier, I want to tackle one specific question that's out there from the audience, and that is, was Hamas elected or did it seize power? In a word, both. It was elected, and then it seized power when the international community did not like the outcome of those elections and imposed a boycott that created this rift within the Palestinian Authority and the conditions for a civil war in which Hamas took over. So hopefully that answers that question. I thought that would be quick and easy. Omar, staying on the subject of Gaza, what is the future of the closure? I mean, if the goal was to shatter the status quo, is the closure going to be eased after this, particularly since there's going to have to be obviously be massive humanitarian assistance. There's going to have to be aid materials, construction materials, all kinds of things coming in. What does this mean for the future of the blockade and the humanitarian situation in general?
Yeah, I mean, look, the UN said back in the day Gaza would be unlivable by 2020, and here we are in October 2023, and we're seeing an unprecedented set of circumstances. I think this conversation here, it's great that we're having it because you don't hear the closure mentioned. It's as if the siege just started October 7th. People forget that for 16 years, there was a generalized ban on travel. Nobody in, nobody out, unless you fit within a narrow band of humanitarian exemptions. People forget that there was also restrictions on the exit of goods, which kept Gaza's economy, basically non-existent, with unemployment hovering around 50%. So I think, and we talked about when you talked about the March or Return protests in 2018, 2019, again, you reach these moments when you keep a 2.2+ million people caged in an open air prison. There are going to be moments in which that becomes an unsustainable arrangement. So I think, Khaled, your analysis in the beginning was probably right on point that, and I think Mouin also raised this as well, is we sort of have hit this point where it's difficult to imagine. It's on one hand difficult to imagine a return to the status quo ex ante where that policy stays as it is. On the other hand, it's difficult to envision a scenario where that's lifted in the current status quo, right? So I think it's difficult to imagine the end game, when I think even the game as we know it isn't clear. But I think it's important to understand that demands that are being made should not just be about returning us back to October 6th or October 5th. There needs to be a lifting of the closure. There needs to be an understanding that the closure policy is not a security policy, right? It's, you could be security cleared to travel if you fit within an exemption one day and not the next day, right? And so I think that's a really important part of the story. The Israeli army, in fact, at different points in the last 16 years, have actually called for a Marshall Plan for Gaza, have actually expressed concern about keeping people bottled up in the way that the policy does. And it's again important to note that it's not only about getting people in Gaza out, but also just getting to the West Bank and the ways in which Israel's promoted the separation policy. And again, we're seeing that filter into the rhetoric of Egypt being the solution. And I think Dana talked about this as well, right? Like there are issues, around Egypt's position. Their legal obligations are different because it's not an occupying power. So our calls on Egypt are different than our calls on Israel. But at the same time, the answer can't be just humanitarian aid through Egypt, just travel through Egypt. We have to understand and center the closure in this policy, and maybe there's an opportunity for us to make the larger advocacy point about lifting it in the current climate. Although again, I really can't predict where we'll be on Monday, much less at the end of all this.
Thanks. So I'm trying to kind of group questions from the audience as much as I can, and so there are a number of questions about the regional / international role, like beyond the let's say the great power, well, beyond the ones we've already discussed. So whoever wants to tackle this, just go ahead and jump in. But one set of questions relates to the regional role more broadly. What is the likelihood that Iran will become embroiled in the conflict or an Israeli attack on Iran? What does this mean for normalization track with Saudi Arabia? What about Hezbollah, of course, also related to the Iran question, and other actors in the region like Qatar, and further afoot like Russia. Russia has, I think, an interesting position. I think it has probably the situation has probably worsened the relationship with Israel. So who wants to tackle this basket of regional, international dimension questions? Or maybe
I'll give it.
you can take pieces of it.
Well, I'll address the so-called axis of resistance aspects. I think these media reports we've seen that this was all closely coordinated with Iran, if not conducted on behalf of Iran, are really not worth the paper they're written on. I mean, so overblown and so lacking, the reporting so lacking in credibility. And even if they were true, they would only demonstrate that Iran is using Hamas as a proxy in order not to have to fight itself. Having said that, I think that after October 7th, only a fool would speculate with confidence over what's going to happen in the next week or so. Now, I think the prospects of a so-called second front on the Lebanese border are quite real. I haven't seen indications that Hezbollah is going to join the fight as a matter of principle, if you will. It does have red lines, which Israel may deliberately cross. And in that case, we would be speaking about a broader conflict. I think Syria will be very hesitant to get directly involved because, it has managed, the Syrian government has managed to secure its control over most of the country in the past several years. And is it going to want to jeopardize what it has managed to achieve in a conflict with Israel, where the government could, in Damascus, could potentially be decapitated? I will say one other thing, that I also feel that Israel, that 2 points. One is that Israel, I think, views this as an opportunity to draw the West and the United States in particular into a potentially direct conflict with its enemies, and preferably Iran. And my second observation is, hidden amongst all this uncritical, unconditional Western support for Israel is also, I think, an interesting message that Israel's image as a security superpower has been shattered also in the West. The US sending an aircraft carrier to the Eastern Mediterranean to warn off others from potentially getting involved in this conflict is, I think, a vote of no confidence in Israel's capacity to defend itself, and the recognition that it can only fight its wars with potentially significant foreign participation.
Can I just jump in
please.
quickly, because there was one question about expanding a little bit on regional governments' responses. So in the cases of the UAE and Bahrain, there were statements about ending the violence and showing sympathy to the victims of the Saturday's attack. The Saudi Crown Prince has been in communication with Mahmoud Abbas and claimed that Saudi Arabia is supportive of the Palestinians having a decent life, not Palestinians having self-determination, sovereignty, none of kind of the minimal things that we discuss in a conflict, but possibly a decent life. And then in all of those cases, it seems that based on the statements and some of the actions in the aftermath of the original attack, there's a concern about containing the conflict. So the UAE is warning Syria not to get involved. Saudi Arabia is saying we want to contain the violence. So it's all about containing the conflict, so that, as I mentioned, I don't think that there's going to be this real push to engage Israel on a number of fronts, but in case it can spill over in a way that these regimes can't control. But in all of those cases, it's angered their own citizens. So Bahraini activists have put out statements condemning their own, foreign ministry statements. Notable Emiratis have again spoken out against the statement of the foreign ministry, especially its a statement that it does not mix trade with politics, that this will not impact its trade with Israel. Yeah, so I don't know if that's enough context, but I think all of the statements and all of the immediate responses have shown that there's really no meaningful push to hold Israel accountable.
Just real quick on this question of the role of Arab states. What about domestic Arab opinion? Is there, there's a lot of unrest in the region, as you all know. And if you look next door in Egypt, they've got some serious problems. There's even a presidential contender who is opposing Sisi in the December elections, such as they are. But at least there's at least an outlet there for some opposition, for some dissent. What is the mood like in a place like Egypt or other countries? And if this becomes very protracted, could that spill over and then create, not necessarily another Arab Spring, but move in that direction? Is that possible?
I mean, if we look at the history of pro-Palestine activism, it's often an incubator and a gateway to wider dissent. The people who engaged in the Arab Spring protests and initiated a lot of that organizing in Egypt were first politicized around the Second Intifada and the protests that they organized around then. So I think if we look at the history of the Palestinian cause as a motivator, as kind of a not instigator, but you understand what I mean, kind of a driver of domestic and local politics, it becomes clear that this is something that even though regimes really want to control and have tried to control, like it can have these spillover effects. Like you said, I don't know that it means an Arab Spring or anything like that, but the Palestinian question frays state-society ties. And I don't know that they always have a handle on it. I mean, we saw in Egypt, there was also the Egyptian policeman who opened fire on an Israeli tourist bus. And so these kinds of things become out of control. And Palestine has always played sympathy with Palestinians and solidarity with Palestinians has always played that role.
Right.
Could I briefly add to that?
Sure.
I think we also need to see what happens tomorrow, because Hamas and its allies and supporters of the Palestinians generally have called for mass demonstrations tomorrow, Friday, throughout the Middle East. And this will give an indication of the popular mood. And I think that's significant for two reasons, because in addition to what Dana has just said, participation in pro-Palestinian activism often also serves as a cover for opposition to domestic regimes. And so the size and scale of such demonstrations could unsettle regional governments. And secondly, they could also send a signal to Western governments that business as usual may be in jeopardy if this goes on for much longer. And the precedent we have here, I think, is the confrontation of the summer of 2021, where you had these mushrooming demonstrations throughout the Arab world, to the point where Mark Milley, at the time the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, gave a statement, I believe, to Congress saying, if this goes on for much longer, it is going to pose an increasing risk to U.S. interests in the region.
Maybe I'll just add to that, and this is a point I've made in other forums as well, is that, I mean, and it's, appropriate, I think, for the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. I think if I were to generalize a bit, I think the trend in much of the Arab world, and this builds on what Mouin said, was, in the 2000s, there I think very much was the original impetus for the protest. A lot of the protests, one of the strands of it obviously came from Second Intifada, Iraq War opposition. But I think with the 2011 Arab Spring protests, you saw a trend of people saying, let us fix our own repressive authoritarian governments, and then we'll turn back to dealing with the question of Palestine and what's happening there. And I think what we've seen in the last few years is in some ways an inversion, or if you're a Saudi activist, you understand that some of the people pushing and safeguarding MBS and similarly in other parts of the cult are the very same ones that are shielding Israel from impunity. So it's created this, at least some conversation around activists. Okay, actually, if we want to work on fighting authoritarianism in our own country, maybe we do need to go back to dealing with the situation of Palestine. And you could, again, envision a scenario where these events accelerate that trend. And so as you see, more steps, and I really don't, I think I'm speculating here, but I really don't think that, also don't think it's had to do with the normalization agreement, but I also, one of the scenarios out here is that could be put forward as a way to end this. That could be, put forward as a way to see us moving forward, for example. Again, I have nothing to base that on, but that could be the cover to say, let's move forward. We have this agreement. We're going to go back to status quo ex ante. So, but the more that these steps take place, the more that it creates these, at least moments of awareness about the ways in which the repressive regimes in the region are often united, despite what the rhetoric might be.
Thanks. Omar, can I ask you a follow-up, sort of unrelated, not necessarily a follow-up, but just something that is maybe tangential, and that is, in a lot of places in the West, including here in the United States, but also the UK, France, elsewhere, we're seeing, I don't know if crackdown is too hard a word, but we're seeing a backlash, certainly against any type of Palestinian activism, because it's seen as an affront to Israeli and Jewish sensibilities. We have, mayors and governors in this country condemning Palestine solidarity rallies, and the people in other countries, or the Western countries, where they want to ban the Palestinian flag, and the UK is debating these things. Where do you see that now? Obviously, there is anti-boycott legislation in most Western countries, and there's a kind of authoritarian backlash that is part of this. Where do you see that going in these different environments? And I know I'm asking you to talk about many different places, US, UK, Canada, but there's likely to be a trend. So do you see a real threat to civil liberties and to Palestinian and Arab communities?
Yeah, look, I mean, again, like so many things here, this isn't a trend that started on October 7th, right? I mean, we saw in Germany, for example, this past May in Berlin, and municipality demonstrations for Palestine that were canceled. We, of course, have legislation in the UK that has to do with limiting the ability of local municipalities to make conscious investment decisions because of concerns around BDS. We have anti-boycott laws in a number of states. We've seen methodical attempts to treat advocacy for Palestinian rights and criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism. So these have been long countering trends, and it's coincided with the ineffectiveness of partisans of the Israeli government to win the argument on the merits. So instead, they've tried to shut down the debate. I think that's the larger shift you see happening, in the West, as the consensus around, for example, apartheid and treatment of Palestinians. Palestinians have been saying it for years and decades. Nobody listened, but the last few years, we've seen more and more momentum around that narrative. We've seen that responsiveness. So now you insert again this event, and it in some ways helps the Israeli government and their partisans to make the argument, which they've been making all along, right? They made it about human rights groups and their advocacy. They made it about nonviolent calls for boycotts. They made it about going to international courts. All of it was terrorism. But now they can make it all about, we've seen that already, the playbook in the last 5-6 days. Again, not just in the United States. We're seeing in countries in Europe. We've seen it, reports in France, in other places where demonstrations for Palestine, waving the Palestinian flag, is being equated with support for Hamas or support for terrorism. So, and now that they have an event in which they can point to, which it creates a greater concern, right? Because I think one of the changes in the last 15 years, because from those of us that remember the US discourse in the early 2000s, it really was suicide bombing versus occupation. And there was a difficulty for the general audience to be able to weigh those things. So you ended up with a reductionist conflict between two equal sides, etc. I think in many ways in the last 15 years, we moved beyond that in understanding the structural repression, the apartheid, the structural violence that undergirds the system, settler colonialism. But are we now back in a world in which the conversation has potentially could regress? And I think our challenge as folks that are involved in the public debate is, while unequivocally condemning attacks on civilians, deliberate killing of civilians, hostage taking of civilians, to remind folks that this is of the larger context, that this is not a conflict between equal parties, that this is that this is a situation of apartheid. And I think these are going to be our challenges, because suddenly we've given all of these disingenuous efforts, inaccurate efforts to link to anti-Semitism, support for terrorists. Suddenly they feel that they have the impetus to double down. And I think there's a real risk if we're not safeguarding the territory. But again, last thing I'll say is you talk to Palestinians and Palestinian activists, they'll say, yes, we need to acknowledge that the debate's being shut, but let's not shift our eye from the atrocities happening on the ground as well. So how do you balance all this? There's a lot to do, but thankfully there's good people like Mouin and Dana and all you folks at CCAS doing it. So.
Yeah, I mean, I guess they're sort of the same question, because you can't really talk about the atrocities if you don't have the space to discuss and debate, right? Picking up on this kind of post 9/11 comparison, because I also remember that period, and especially in relation to the Palestinians. Obviously there was 9/11 had a huge impact on everything, but there's one key difference, which is I mean, there are many key differences, but one that I find striking is in terms of the mood, politically and in public opinion. Even in the worst days of the Intifada, even when there were suicide bombings on a regular basis, you still had U.S. and Western diplomatic officials who could speak in terms of civilians should be protected. I think at one point the George W. Bush administration even used the term war crimes in relation to Israeli actions in Gaza. And we didn't, there was lots of dehumanizing rhetoric about Arabs and Muslims in general. But even as bad as that was, we don't have anything like the total silence or near total silence that you have now, where no one is saying anything about protecting civilians. And at the same time, there's all this inflammatory, dehumanizing stories. We've all seen the beheaded babies stories and the mass rapes and all of that. And it's just being swallowed up and regurgitated. How much does that impact? I mean, I guess I'm answering my own question, but I mean, it's obviously it's pretty awful. But anyway, I guess that was more commentary. So how much time do we have left?
We have about 10 minutes.
Okay. So we have one question for Dana. In terms of the irrelevancy of the PA and problems with Hamas, would that create space for some kind of alternative, like someone like Mustafa Barghouti, or the third way, this ever elusive third way that Palestinians have been searching for? Is there an opportunity to insert some kind of new force into Palestinian politics?
I'm a generally, like, as a personal characteristic and a personal failing, I'm kind of a pessimist. But I mean, Mustafa Barghouti has ran in elections and hasn't achieved great public support. With all due respect to him as a thinker and a political activist. But I mean, to be honest, I don't see where, like, let me rephrase. the Palestinian imagination, like political imagination, is most captured by activists and like resistance that are not really involved on this level of politics. They're not really involved in kind of the formal politics, or institutional politics of any kind. I can understand why that's the case, because young people have lived in this status quo for quite a while, and these are the sources of commentary that speak to their issues in a way that's not kind of stunted or stagnant. But at the same time, there's an issue here, which is that a lot of those activists, or even the armed groups, they will not be able to scale up any kind of like larger Palestinian response. And so that's why we're kind of stuck at this kind of devolvement situation. I mean, again, I am a pessimist, so perhaps I just lack the political imagination to see where an alternative can emerge. But for now, I'm talking short term, medium term. I don't think like the Palestinian National Initiative is where people are putting their hopes, or that it resonates with people. That's what I meant to say.
Okay, let me just check the new questions coming in.
Khaled, as you do that, maybe just a quick comment. I need to say something about the 9/11 thing, which I think has been such a faulty narrative. Let's not forget that many of the tactics that the United States used post 9/11, targeted killings, torture, they came from the Israeli playbook. They used and these were things that were criticized before 9/11, in some cases by former U.S. Diplomats, right? The idea that, well, suddenly there was innocence and suddenly, now we're changing all our values, certainly wasn't right about the U.S., certainly isn't right in the context of Israel. So I think it's important to sort of call out that narrative, which I think tries to, create a false equation between September 11th and what took place on October 7th. Again, not to say that these incidents were justified, but to understand there is a very, very different context, and there's a very different reality, and there's a different reality before and after.
If I could, sorry, go ahead, Khaled.
Sure. No, go ahead.
I mean, I was going to jump in and ask one of the questions in the Q&A, because it came up in this event we had earlier today with Neve Gordon. But there's a question about kind of like comparing recent event to more conventional conflicts of the past, and does this comparison run the risk of minimizing the impact of the more civilian targeted warfare of today? And that's also sort of related to the question of kind of what means are at the disposal of both sides, and kind of there's so much outrage about the targeting of civilians, rightful outrage about the targeting of civilians by Hamas and Islamic Jihad. But there's the kind of targeting of civilians from warplanes that doesn't have the same effect, right? It doesn't have the same effect because it's this war from a distance. So I think that speaks to part of this question, right? Comparing, like, is the conflict we're seeing now like any other conflict we've seen? Is the war we're seeing now like any other conflict? And I'm asking kind of a second question to that, which is, does the kind of like the technology and the unevenness of this too also make it really hard to think about? Or does it make this war really different than any other in terms of the type of civilian casualties?
You can answer the second one legally, because that's easy, right? Legally, the laws of war make no distinction between parties on the basis of power imbalances, right? So like, and whether or not they're legitimate in their right to use force or not, right? The idea is all must apply, abide by the laws of war, because if you were to permit the targeting of civilians because of a disparity of power, right, you would suddenly create an exception that negates the rule, right? Entirely, right? Oh, sorry, we can't distinguish, so we need to use it. I understand, people, again, from a political analysis, people will tell you, well, we'll make an argument, but the reason why humanitarian human rights law provides some normative framework is because it applies equally to all parties. And so, yes, there's a power analysis you can do, but as somebody who applies the law, that's how you have to go about sort of doing it. So you can't say, well, you can't make this I think it's important to note that legally, but I'll leave your other questions to my more, my colleagues who understand maybe the comparative question better.
I think we have time for Mouin and Dana for one more last comment for each of you.
Yeah, I'll keep this brief then. I think there's increasing comparisons to be made between what we're seeing now and what we saw in 1982 with the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and particularly with the siege of West Beirut, where water was also cut off, where electricity was also cut off, where there was indiscriminate area bombing with growing numbers of civilian casualties, and where Western politicians were basically ecstatically applauding up to the Sabra and Shatila massacres.
Yes, but there was a U.S. envoy on the ground there actively working for a ceasefire, at least. But anyway, Dana, go ahead.
I don't really have much to say aside from the fact that, like, I think in an increasingly violent status quo, the likelihood of the kinds of maybe what was described as like sadistic violence increases. I think that's clear. So I know that there are power imbalances and that there are, like you mentioned, like there are different technologies of warfare available to the two or a number of actors, but generally speaking, if it's a violent and increasingly violent status quo, these kinds of violations will become more likely.
Fida, do you want to close us out?
Sure. Maybe I just want to make one comment about this question that I posed from the audience too before closing it out, which is, in part, I was just trying to think about kind of like the optics of this war in the US and thinking about kind of, the kind of discourse of collateral damage that the US used in a post 9/11. And so that I feel like, because a lot of the questions in the audience, and this is what we're hearing from our community in Georgetown, right, in our Arab studies community, is just like the absolute dehumanization of Palestinians in this discourse here, and how this, is giving the Israelis green light and is raising all these kind of red flags for how bad this could go. And but I was also thinking about how the technology also just is like this way in which it hides the violence, right? Because that's all. I was thinking about kind of how people see violence in an audience in the West, right, and what they view as violence, and there is like the kind of, we don't ever think of this as states as terrorists, but it's also kind of, what are the images that capture people's emotions,
and it's also,
right?
Also what our media choose to broadcast 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I don't recall seeing anything like this since 9/11 in terms of media coverage. It's really quite remarkable. So it's impossible to imagine that this won't dramatically affect public opinion. And for the person who asked a question about impact on U.S. elections, maybe that's a good topic for a future event, but it will clearly have, I think, ramifications there. I think that just about does it in terms of time, right?
Yeah, so I just want to thank you all again, and thank you all for everything you're doing to try to inform a broader public and to kind of address these gaps in the media that we've just been talking about. And thank you for your time, and for everyone who participated today. We had over 100 folks online for most of the time. Thank you very much.